what you're going to see tonight is something that should be able to bring all of us together. Because we're not going to point out to some bad guy. You're going to see some pretty awful things that are taking place here. So what I'd like to introduce you to is the United Nations Agenda 21. We're going to learn all about this tonight. And it also goes by another name, Sustainable Development. You'll find that these two terms are used interchangeably. So we're going to trace the very history of it. So to understand the documents, you have to understand the people who put those documents together. In 1986, the United Nations requested a report be done. Actually, in 1982, they requested the report. It was finally completed in 87. They requested a report that said, what can we do to protect our planet against things like global warming, against the misuse of our natural resources, and also to eliminate poverty. So they asked Gro Brundtland if she would head up a commission and write this report. So you have to let's understand a little bit about Gro Brundtland. Gro Brundtland was the Prime Minister of Norway 3 times in a row. She's a popular gal. Gro is also the Vice President of the World Socialist Party. Now, since most of the world is socialist anyway, that's not so hard to believe. That makes sense. But what we might understand is what Gro believes. If you go onto the website of the World Socialist Party here in the United States, our chapter of it, here's what it says. The World Socialist Party of the United States is part of a globalist socialist movement that believes capitalism cannot meet the needs of the majority of people in the world, however progressive it might become. To meet these needs, capitalism must be replaced by socialism. Now, there's nothing wrong with this if that's what you believe in, but you need to understand, if you're going to understand where Agenda 21 came from and how this whole piece came to be put together, you need to understand the people who wrote the documents that created it. This gal thinks we need to get rid of capitalism, so that's one of her main objectives. We also have another gentleman I'd like to introduce you to named Maurice Strong. Now, Maurice is kind of an interesting guy. He was the former director of the UN Environmental Program. He's also the chairman of the World Wildlife Foundation. Now, Maurice is a cool guy to get to know. Maurice, by the time he was 25 years old, was the president of Dome Petroleum in Canada. So he was already doing fairly well for himself. He also purchased 200,000 acres of land over the largest freshwater aquifer in the United States, along with Adnan Khashoggi. We all remember who Adnan Khashoggi is? Yeah. Everyone heard? He was the arms dealer that got in trouble a whole bunch of years back. But he was in the newspaper, I guess, probably in the 80s. He was in there most of the time. So these two got together, bought the land up, and the idea was, what we'll do is we'll just barricade the water and then release it to the southwestern United States, and we'll make a fortune for ourselves. We'll control all the water flow to all these farmers down there that need water. So it's like a real cool way to make money. Except the environmental groups the local environmental groups came in and they said, well, wait a minute, you can't do this. So they stopped him and they made him pull out of there, and they paid him a few $1 million to get lost, and he wasn't really very environmentally friendly. So, for some bizarre reason, this guy, who just got chased out by environmental groups, suddenly was called upon in 1979 to become the director of the UN Environmental Program. Why? Well, I don't know. Sometimes maybe it's who you know and not what it is that you do. So we have two players here. One who's a socialist who said, I need to destroy the capitalist system. The other who made a fortune in the capitalist system, but then moved onward and decided the environmental program was a better way. Not exactly on the up and up all the time, dealing with arms traders, doing shady deals with land and so on, and also the head of an oil company. So some of the things he did were not completely on the up and up. If you try to track Maurice down today, you can probably find him because he lives in China. Anybody remember the Oil for Food program? And the scandal that followed that? Yeah. That was Maurice. He was in the middle of it. So we're having a little bit of trouble tracking Maurice down these days. But these are the players. These are the two guys who were mostly responsible for this. A book called Our Common Future. By 1987, that book was completed. And it outlined exactly what sustainable development would look like. In fact, there's the report. I don't want you to, by the way, let me preface this. I don't want you to take my word for anything that I say this evening. Everything is documented, everything's provable. Amazon.com, you can buy this book for, I don't know, 15, 20 bucks, you can buy the book. And if you go to chapter 2 in here, it will define what sustainable development is. It is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sound familiar? I know I just heard that just a moment ago. Yeah, that was Maurice back in 1979 at the United Nations. So that kind of, worked its way right in here in this book in chapter 2 called Towards a Sustainable Development. Now what this book does is it defines what mankind throughout the world, this isn't just the United States, this is every nation on earth, what mankind has to do in order to protect the planet from this new thing that was just starting, this whole global warming thing, right about then that was starting to gain popularity, to protect the planet from climate change and protect the planet from being destroyed by man. That's what this report did. So in there they said, this is what we need to do. And all this sounds good until you read the report. Because inside the report it says that poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems. Well, that's kind of interesting, because what I just did is I took an environmental problem and I related to a poverty problem. So I now combined the two. The report goes on to say that certain nations are destroying this earth more so than others. So what we need to do is we need to take the resources from those nations that are destroying the earth and we need to transfer those to other parts of the world. So the developing nations need to take the money from the wealthier nations. And in doing so, that's going to protect the environment. Now, when you start taking wealth and redistributing, remember the president said, well, we need to spread wealth around a little bit? You probably thought what he was referring to was, from a guy who's making $300,000 a year down to a guy who's making $30,000 a year. That wasn't exactly what the whole story was. There's a larger scheme here, and that larger scheme says that we must transfer wealth out of the United States of America and more prosperous nations and into less prosperous nations if in fact we expect the planet to survive. Now thank God these were just two guys, sitting in a room in the cellar of the United Nations writing this report out, because how many people in here have ever read a United Nations report? Right, nobody reads these things anyway. So, okay, right now it's just a cockamamie idea. We're going to take the money out of America, transfer it somewhere else, and somehow that's going to save the planet. Okay, fine. It's nothing but a report, so we can all take a sigh of relief, breathe, and this whole thing's not going to bother us at all. Except for one little thing. They said what we need to have is an Earth Summit. So they did. 5 years later, in 1992, in Rio de Janeiro, they had the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. That was called Agenda 21. That's where the name comes from. It's an agenda for the 21st century. And it was no longer two people in the basement of the United Nations in New York. All of a sudden, it was 18,000 people who showed up. And at this meeting, they codified what Agenda 21 was going to look like. So while this book talked about sustainable development, there we go. I knew it was there. It was buried in the basement of the UN. This book codified the report here. So we now have an action plan. Everybody in here heard the word Agenda 21? Have you heard it? You heard the name? Okay, this is it. This is Agenda 21. It's not a fantasy. It's not some tinfoil hat scheme. This is Agenda 21. And if you want to buy it, you can go on the United Nations website. You can go to Google, pick United Nations Agenda 21, and then you can go purchase it. Or you can download it for free on some different websites also. But this now says what the world must look like and how we can roll it out and make that happen. In short, this is a high-level action plan. There's business people in here. So we have action plans to make things work, right? So that's what this is. This is an action plan. Well, okay, so we have a meeting. And Maurice Strong just so happens. Remember Maurice? He was the guy that was trying to tie up all the fresh water, right? And the guy that's hiding out in China right now from the oil for fruit scandal. Okay, well Maurice is back. It's 1992, and now he's at the Earth Summit in Rio, and he walks out on stage, just like I did a few moments ago. He had a few more people there. And instead of saying, well, am I wired up and can you guys hear me? He said something a little different. These were his opening remarks. Current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, the use of fossil fuels, electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable. Remember we said it was towards a sustainable community, towards sustainability? Well, now we're deciding what's no longer sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, that means we must begin to eliminate it. He also said, is it the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? That was Maurice Strong in his role as founder of the United Nations Environmental Program. Again, understand the people you're dealing with, and then you can understand the outcomes. There are no outcomes, there's only people. They drive them and make them happen. So this is Maurice. Well, the meeting was over. Actually, the meeting was being designed. The Convention on Biological Diversity was part of the folks that got together to actually draw up this booklet that you see right here. They were part of one portion of the authors of this booklet. And they decided that, okay, that's pretty good, that's all right, that gives us a lot of information, but what we really need to do is we need something that's a practical tool for translating the principles of Agenda 21 into reality. So we need to make all this stuff at meetings into reality that's going to go somewhere. You know, booklets are fine, we need to do something with it. Well, if you're going to take over the whole world, I guess you need a little more, something a little bigger. So they got it. They created the Global Biodiversity Assessment, and that's what this guy is. And this Global Biodiversity Assessment chunks down the action plan that's in this book, in 40 chapters in this book, and it breaks it into a worldwide program and says what each nation is going to have to look like if we're going to actually save the planet. So in here it defines, and by the way, you can buy this. I got this from Cambridge University. There's only a few copies left, but they're floating around. You can get a hold of these things. So in here they define not only what the Earth has to look like when we get done, it's going to define what America is going to look like. And I'm going to show you what this book says America is going to look like. Now, thank heavens this is still a UN book, right? So we don't have to worry. This is still at the UN, yeah, that's all right. So we're America, you know, and nothing can happen here, so we're okay. So here we are. This is the book. But let's take a look inside this book, because in here it tells you what's not sustainable. So if it's not sustainable, what has to happen to it? It's got to go. It's got to go. It's got to be limited or eliminated. Limited or eliminated if it's not sustainable, according to this book. Well, here's what's in this book. Unsustainable activities. Do you like to ski? Well, skiing is considered unsustainable. Do you like little fish ponds in your backyard? Where you have koi and all these little guys floating around, you go out and watch them each day? Well, you're not going to be able to do that if the folks that wrote this book got their way. But they're not going to get their way because this is America and this stuff doesn't happen here, so that works. Pastures where you can graze your horses. Do you like golfing? Anybody like running golf? Well, golf courses are considered unsustainable. Asphalt, macadam, roadways, concrete are considered unsustainable. Unsustainable human activities are dams. You're going to start noticing dams are beginning to disappear in America. I don't know if you've noticed that or not, but just check the news and start to see what's going on. For one reason or another, they're going to start going down because they're unsustainable. Bends in rivers that are human-made, that have been straightened, where there was a bend and man straightened it, that is unsustainable because it's not natural. The scales of justice in the United States of America are unsustainable. All of this comes from this book, by the way. Why are the scales of justice in America unsustainable? Private property is unsustainable. Americans have too much private property, and the majority of our wealth is tied up in private property. Therefore, one thing we need to do to return the Earth to its natural state is to begin to reduce the amount of private property that's held throughout the world, not just the United States, but throughout the world. Consumerism is unsustainable. Why in the world is consumerism unsustainable? Well, if I buy stuff, somebody has to make stuff. And if somebody makes that stuff, then they're running machines and they're using up natural resources to make it. So therefore, the less I buy, the safer the planet's going to be. Again, all in Global Biodiversity Assessment. And the family unit is unsustainable because we're suffering from overpopulation. You're going to find that when people come into your area, particularly planners, and they come up with this grand scheme as to what they're going to do, very often one of the reasons they come in is because overpopulation. Oh, the population is exploding. But according to that book, we can only support about 1 billion people on the planet. Right now there's 7 billion, we're headed for 15 billion. How they're going to shrink that back down, I don't even want to think about. But anyway, there's too many people out there. So therefore we can't just have these burgeoning family units the way they are. We need to take precautions to see that the family unit remains small. And most of all, we have what we call the Wildlands Program. Now the Wildlands Program is what the United States will look like if this book is implemented. And so you know where this came from. It's on page 993, actually it's 993 or 933, I forget which one it is. It's on page 933 or 993 in here. It defines what the Wildlands Project is. And the intent of the Wildlands Project is to remove human beings from 50% of the United States. These red zones that you see up in here, out there, are no human habitation is allowed in those areas. The yellow zones around those are buffer zones. You'll be able to use those zones basically as protectionary and precautionary to see that nothing takes place inside these zones, which are fully at their natural vegetative state. The only people allowed in the buffer zones will be members of the federal government, officers, code enforcement, and so on and so forth. Again, all outlined in this book. So, where do you think we're going to live? If the wild animals and the wolves and everybody else is taking over the rest of it, where are we?
Inner cities.
Well, that's about it. We're over here in these little dots that you might see here. And you'll see little black dots over here and little black dots over here. And those are what we call high-density habitats. So this book, and in conjunction with several different meetings of the United Nations, each over a 5-year period from Johannesburg, Germany, right up to present day, have defined what it's going to take worldwide to get us to look like that. Now this map is kind of interesting because you say to yourself, well, okay, this is America, you know, nothing like that could ever happen here. And thank God it was still only a United Nations book, right? So we're okay, we're safe, we're sound, this is a bunch of people from the UN, we'll never have to worry about it. Let's just go back and live life the way we were living it, because it can't happen, well, maybe it can happen. In 1992, George H.W. Bush signed the agreement, a soft treaty in Rio, to implement Agenda 21, Sustainable Development in the United States. He agreed, became a signatory to what they call the Rio Declaration, which you all have a copy of. I think if you have a little copy of this sheet of paper that has the United Nations logo on the upper left-hand corner. He signed on to that and agreed to bring it to the United States. Now we're still safe, okay, we don't have to worry about it, because a soft treaty has no teeth. So it means you can't enforce it, you can't do anything with it. So thank God, maybe old George made a mistake, but we're still covered. Except for one thing. In June of 1993, Bill Clinton came along and he signed Executive Order 12852, which created the President's Council on Sustainable Development to begin implementation in federal agencies. And that's called, this. Towards a Sustainable America. There are 7 of these, and you can download them. I'll give you a website. You can go there and you can download them, or you can order them from the U.S. Printing Office. These were done back in the early 90s. In here, he defines, the Council on Sustainable Development defines exactly what sustainable development is going to look like in the United States of America. So let's just trace the breadcrumbs, like Hansel and Gretel did. We're going to follow through, make sure we get back home again. Let's understand, we had Gros and Maurice and a team of 12 other people put together a report for the UN saying how we're going to save the United States, and this came out back in 1987. This said we need to develop a sustainable world, not just America, not just America. That report was codified in the UN Agenda 21 in 1992. George Bush signed on to it and agreed to everything that's in this book, the Global Biodiversity Assessment. It didn't mean anything because it was a soft treaty and had no teeth until Bill Clinton signed it into an executive order and established the President's Council on Sustainable Development. It is now in the United States. It's here. It crossed the borders. We can no longer say this is just some scheme in the basement of the UN at the end of 42nd Street. Well, it didn't stop there, because once Bill signed the order, everybody else got on board. By 1997, the U.S. Conference of Mayors had created the Joint Center for Sustainable Communities. And why wouldn't they? If I say sustainable development, I don't think bad things, I think good things. I think I want to, recycle my garbage. I want to take care of my front lawn. I want to, build a home that's built responsibly. What could possibly be wrong with sustainable development? And the answer is, there's nothing wrong with sustainable development. What's wrong is when you take a good idea and you co-opt it with a political agenda. That's what's wrong. So we need to make those distinctions. When do I really have sustainable development, and really do I have a political agenda that calls itself sustainable development? By 2001, the National Governors Association endorsed smart growth, advancing statewide sustainable development. And in 2011, President Barack Obama signed Executive Order 13575 and created the White House Rural Communities Act, enabling implementation of sustainable development in 16% of the United States of America. Well, okay, it's still a bunch of executive orders, right? I mean, how can you turn an executive order into something that's going to bother me in my own backyard? I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. And is this really Agenda 21? Come on, I mean, this is, can't possibly be. Well, actually, if you go into that book, which I just held up there, The President's Council on Sustainable Development is explicitly charged with recommending a national action plan on how to achieve a sustainable development in the U.S. The PCSD was conceived, and here it is, to formulate recommendations for the implementation of Agenda 21. So when somebody looks at you and they say, oh, you're nuts, we're not part of Agenda 21, I want you to go right to this website right here, or Google it. State Department submission to the 5th session of the Commission on Sustainable Development, or just State Department 5th session PCSD, that'll do it, April 1997. And you're going to find that the only reason the President's Council was formed was to implement Agenda 21. There was no other reason.
Did they read?
Do they what?
Did they read?
They do read. Yeah, they read. Now, how did this get to our backyard? Because presidents control regulatory agencies. And regulatory agencies write what? Regulations. That's what they do for a living. They sit there and they write regulations. So now we just bypassed Congress. There's nothing to vote on any longer. There's nothing that your council has to, the congressman or your senator has anything to do with, because we bypassed that whole process. When the president created an executive order, he now embedded it down in 11 of the federal agencies at that time. But he also partnered up with non-governmental organizations, but groups like the APA here, the American Planning Association, Institute for Sustainable Communities, the Trust for Public Land, and so on. All of these principles that were put together in here and from this global biodiversity assessment, they now made their way down into these agencies. So when regulations are being drawn up by the EPA, when they're being drawn up by the Forest Service and so on, they're in compliance with the President's Council on Sustainable Development, because that's what agencies do. They're supposed to be in compliance with what the President says. He's the boss. He gets to tell them what they can do and what they're not allowed to do. So the motto of this whole Agenda 21 program is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Have you ever heard that before? Where did we hear that one before? Oh, Maurice. Maurice came out with that, and all of a sudden now it's worked its way all the way up into the Agenda 21. And Agenda 21 consists of 3 E's. These 3 E's, by the way, are defined in this book. Came right out of this book. So you can go in there and you can find what they are. First one is social equity. Social equity is when the individual gives up his personal wants for the needs of the community. We're going to tear into that a little bit more, take a closer look at it. Economic prosperity is part of the 3 E's. Free market is replaced by public-private partnerships, and there's an international transfers of wealth. We're going to talk about that a little. And then ecological integrity, where individual rights are subordinated to environmental needs. So what does all this mean to you and I? Well, laws, under social equity, laws coerce individuals to give up their personal wants for the needs of the community. Or, as Harvey Rubin there said, individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective in the process of implementing sustainable development. Harvey Rubin is a member of ICLEI. We'll hear a little more about ICLEI in just a moment here. Individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective. What kind of talking is this? Is this, yeah, it's kind of weird. This is not American talking. This is not what we think of when we think of the United States of America and buying a little piece of property where I can, have a little stream in the backyard and raise my kids and put a little swing set for my grandchildren. But all of a sudden we've got a whole new language that's happening, and it's all in the name of this sustainable development. Economic prosperity, there's 2 components of economic prosperity according to Our Common Future, according to the Agenda 21 book, and according to the 7 pamphlets, 7 booklets that are put out by the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And the transfer of wealth simply means this. The developmental and environmental objectives of Agenda 21 will require a substantial flow of new and additional financial resources to developing nations. The Rio Declaration says equity will be achieved through implementation of the international economic order and through transfers of resources to developing countries. Do you get what I'm talking about here? We're going to save the planet. We're not going to save the planet by living responsibly. We're not going to save the planet by recycling. We're going to save the planet by creating a whole new social structure among the people who live there. Now, this would be wacky if it was nothing but a report written in the basement of the United Nations in 1987. But that's not what it is anymore. Now it's here in the United States of America. So when we talk about this Agenda 21 preamble, you're going to find that here in the pamphlet that paper I just handed out, which is the front pages of this book. That's where it came from. I want you to know where every bit of this comes from, because I don't want you to ever not be able to hold your head up high in any company and say, that's what this is, because you're going to meet people who have no idea. They're up to their eyeballs in Agenda 21, and they don't know it. And they honestly, genuinely, sincerely have no idea what it is that's going on. So in that case, you need to educate. But we're going to look at a couple of these principles in just a minute. These are the principles that drive this entire system. That's called the Rio Declaration. Remember, this is what George Bush signed off on. What are public-private partnerships? Well, public-private partnerships are kind of neat, because if you're, let's say, a benefit corporation, or if you're a corporation that works in conjunction with the government, you get certain tax breaks, you get certain limited liabilities. The problem with public-private partnerships is this. The guy who's on the outside has a rough time with it. If you're not part of the PPP, then you're part of the free enterprise system. All of a sudden, you're paying the high taxes, you have the normal liabilities, you have limited access to those federal dollars, you have high competition, high cost of getting a hold of cash and money, and you often run into a struggle to survive. Ultimately, PPPs, if they grow large enough, they begin to drive out that middle-class businessman that's so essential to survival in the United States of America. That's one of the pieces that I'm here for. I'm one of those free enterprise guys in the middle who runs a small business. So I begin to see around me how these things happen. And we have ecological integrity. That was the third E. This is where individual rights are subordinated to nature. It's nature over man. In the Rio Declaration, human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They're entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. It goes on to say that to achieve sustainable development, states, and all the United States is to the UN, just another state, neither we get capitalized. But other than that, that's all we are. States should reduce and eliminate unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. And we already know what the unsustainable patterns of production and consumption are, because they're all outlined here in this report. And they didn't put this report together just to have a report sit in the basement of the United Nations and nobody look at it. Now, a lot of people never heard of Agenda 21. A lot of people never heard of the things that I'm talking about. Now I'm going to tell you why you haven't heard about it. I'm sure many people in this room heard Agenda 21 and they said, not so sure about that. Well, it's no accident. One of President Clinton's advisors was a gentleman named J. Gary Lawrence. He was an advisor to the President's Council on Sustainable Development. Today, he's the urban strategist leader with Arup Consulting. If you're in the consulting field, planning, they're probably one of the biggest in the world. They're huge. They built the Sydney Opera House. They built the Tappan Zee Bridge. I mean, these guys are major, serious players. But they're also up to their necks in this thing called Agenda 21 and smart growth. So here's what J. Gary Lawrence wrote in a document at the bottom of here. I don't want you to take my word for it. The future of Agenda 21 in the new millennium. Google that, and you can download this document. If you can't find it, email me and I'll send it to you. Here's what he said. Participating in a United Nations advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. Therefore, we will call our process something else, such as comprehensive planning, growth management, or smart growth. Why? Because these are terms that we're all familiar with, we all feel safe with, we all feel comfortable with. They're things that builders and contractors and homeowners have used on a day-to-day basis for 20 years or more. And they're fine, they're safe. So why not hide behind that? And that's what they did. In fact, all that is a plan to get to this. So unfortunately, when you walk out of here tonight, you're going to have to think about this stuff. You're going to have to ask lots and lots of questions to find out, where are we going with this thing? Is this just part of this? Or is this something different? So, in order to make all this function, in order to make this a reality, we needed two systems. One was smart growth. Smart growth essentially manages people and urban development, and the Wildlands Project manages the rural land. Between the two of them, they drive people off of the rural lands into the urban areas and get people out of automobiles and into bicycles and walking. That's where this walkable community all comes from. It's not just the nice idea that walking is good exercise. It's also the fact that we have another agenda here. And we're trying to fulfill this and see that this becomes a reality. So how did this now get to my backyard? We've gotten it down into every community in the United States. So how do I now take this idea of the President's Council on Sustainable Development book over here and get it into, I don't know, Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, or Lehighton, or wherever it might be? Well, actually, that's relatively simple. Money. All we did was we allocated money from the President's Council on Sustainable Development, and we gave it to different agencies. One was HUD. HUD then contracted with groups like the American Planning Association. And the American Planning Association is not the only planning association in America, but it's the gorilla on the block. It's the biggest one. They have 100,000 members. They have 11,000 designated planners around the United States. And essentially all they did was they put together a boilerplate program that implemented Sustainable America throughout the United States of America. And this is what the boilerplate program looks like. So when a planner comes into your area, and he's from the American Planning Association, or she is from American Planning Association, this is where all that fancy planning comes from. You think you're going to visioning meetings and you're coming up with this really neat idea that's just meant for our community. And while there may be a few little modifications here or there, essentially these are all boilerplate. No matter what the plan is, no matter what community you live in, they're all the same as if it's part of this Sustainable Development Program. But one of these wasn't enough. You still see the screen out there? Okay. So one of these wasn't enough. So we came out with two of them. So this is the second. So there's 1,500 pages of boilerplate. So it doesn't matter where you live, whether you live in Tucson, Arizona, whether you live in Syracuse, New York, whether you live in Santa Cruz, New Mexico, or whether you live in Stockholm, Sweden. The plans are essentially all identical. They're all based on what came out of here, which is driven by what came out of here. In addition to these planning organizations implementing Agenda 21 throughout various communities. By the way, Agenda 21 is in every county in the United States of America. If you doubt me, then just plug in sustainable development, social equity. Let's separate this sustainable development, the kind you and I think of, which is healthy, from social equity, the UN thing, and your county, and see what pops up. You're going to find it in there. Also, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the World Resources Institute, International Union for Conservation in Nature, these all fund and provide grants and provide documentation and direction to implement a Sustainable Development Agenda 20, the Agenda 21 version of it. These guys you may never have heard of. They are some of the largest NGOs in the world. In many cases, they have millions of members. They have the clout of small nations. And here's why. When a treaty is put together, these are the people with the money to do the due diligence and the background work to put those treaties together. So they'll actually provide the documentation to an emerging country or even a fully developed nation, and that will become the basis for a full-blown treaty later on. It starts out as a soft treaty and becomes a full-blown treaty. So you probably may not have heard of these folks, but you have heard of these folks. The Sierra Club, Audubon Society, Nature Conservancy, National Wildlife Federation. Part of the bylaws and regulations that they function by are in direct compliance with what comes out of Agenda 21. Now let me just, time out. I'm not saying that everything the Sierra Club ever did was bad. It's not. They do a lot of good stuff. I'm not saying everything the Audubon Society did was bad. They do a lot of good stuff. In the same way with the National Wildlife and Nature Conservancy. They do a lot of good things to help our planet and to help our nation. But they're also doing some things that are going to implement this. So again, we've got to make those distinctions when we're sitting down with our local planners or we attend our local planning meetings. ICLEI is one of those non-governmental organizations that we just talked about. They don't belong to the United Nations, but they do work in concert with them and often at the auspices of them. Their job was to roll out Agenda 21. We have the documentation where there's actual meetings between the United Nations and the officers running ICLEI, and they said, this is your job. We want you guys, since you've done such a good job so far, to take the wheel and roll out Agenda 21. And so they did. This just scrolls and goes on and on and on and on. And I just want to give you some kind of an idea of the impact that this group ICLEI has here in the United States of America. So when somebody says ICLEI is not part of the UN, excuse me, but they are part of it. They're not part of the UN, but they've been authorized by the United Nations to go into all these communities to implement the Agenda 21 programs we were just talking about. So this leveraging that's taking place, here's where it took place. And by the way, this is all in Executive Order 13575, so you can go on, Google it, download it, take a look at it. Executive Order 13575. We impact engagement, improve, leverage our engagement with agricultural organizations, small businesses, educational institutions, healthcare providers, telecommunication services, healthcare providers, research institutions, healthcare providers, healthcare providers. What does healthcare providers have to do with sustainable development? Well, if you read Agenda 21, it says in here, every person on earth must be covered with health insurance. Now, am I saying that the Affordable Care Act that President Obama passed last year was part of Agenda 21? No, I'm not, because I don't know if he did it with this in mind or not. I can't get inside the guy's head. I don't know. All I know is it certainly works in concert with it, so it worked out rather well. If he did it or not is anybody's guess. But the reality is, healthcare was already written into Agenda 21 and already signed on by the United States. Law enforcement, state government agencies, local government agencies, all subject to leveraging by the federal government, which essentially gives the federal government power over food production, land use, and a de facto cap and trade program for 16% of the United States of America. That's what Executive Order 13575 does for you and I. What will happen is, in this Agenda 21 version of Sustainable Development, which is all over the place, a planner or a group member from ICLA or NGO or maybe from the American Planning Association will approach certain stakeholders in your community. And a stakeholder is not necessarily somebody who lives in the community, it's a like-minded individual who agrees with what the planner wants. And they come in with a crisis. It's always a crisis. And generally the crisis is overpopulation, overcrowding, water challenges, too much farmland, too little farmland, you're not going to be able to supply the food for the people in the area. There's like 4 or 5 key crises. And when these guys come in, they are always the same. Well, once they come into a community with this so-called crisis, and they meet with the stakeholders, they will then send out a survey. And I'm going to show you what these surveys look like. The survey is a stacked deck. You can't win with this thing. Then the stakeholders are invited to a visioning meeting, and finally they begin to implement the program. So let's back up here. I have stakeholders coming in, so let's take a look at what that looks like. I start with a survey. I don't know if you can see that up there or not. This is from Carver, Massachusetts. And this survey went on for about 20 pages with a bunch of questions. But every one of the questions was loaded. For instance, number 1, how important is the rural character of Carver? Well, what are you going to say? It's not. I don't care about the rural character of Carver. So you're going to say, well, yeah, sure. Or number 2, which of the following do you feel, and we're talking about farmland, land for outdoor use, areas of historical worth, areas for passive outdoor recreation. Essentially, if you read A through M, I just took up your whole community. There's nothing left. So which of these following do you feel should be protected or acquired? I'm giving you a big choice here. Do you want me to protect your land, or do you want me to take it away from you? Which would you like? I'll be more than happy to do either one. So these things are a stacked deck that you can't win. If you ignore the thing and you throw it away, then you're not part of the process. If you fill it out, more than likely you're providing a lot, some, or a little of impetus to move the program forward. And the program is always the one that's designed by the visionary, the planners that come into your organization. And then, of course, when you get done, out come these great-looking graphs that end up popping up in the local newspaper, and and yes, this is happening across the United States in different communities. In Kings County, Washington, 141,000 acres was lost of homeowners. Homeowners' development rights were lost on 141,000 acres. 2,400 potential dwelling units were moved into urban areas. When you get involved with these community programs through this Agenda 21 program, everything is predetermined. You think your visioning is yours. You think these ideas are yours. You think there's a consensus among the community, but in fact that consensus has already been predetermined. Over in New Jersey, this is going, a great example, this is a group called Sustainable New Jersey. Now we've met with these people, and they've sworn up and down we have nothing to do with UN Agenda 21. We have nothing to do with the sustainable development that you're talking about. Now, we're pure is the term they love to use. Except that, if you look down here, look down here, I don't know if you can see it from there. Their program encompasses the 3 equal interrelated components of sustainability: prosperity, which is economic prosperity; planet practice, which was the environment; and people embrace social equity. So equity, environment, and the economy, the 3 E's are right there in their program. That's Sustainable Jersey. But it doesn't just stop there. Sustainable Jersey in practically every town over in New Jersey. If you go to little town of Denville, in the township of Denville in New Jersey, you go on their website and what do you see? That first line right there, I don't know if you can make it out. The township of Denville has been certified as a sustainable community by Sustainable New Jersey. And what is sustainable development? Well, right there it is. Social equity, environment, and the economy, exactly as we took it out of the original report for the UN. The UN 3 E's are now in every single state in the United States of America. What's sustainable development? Go to the township of Denville, and again we see meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs is one of the most popularly defined definitions of sustainability. It takes its root in the 1987 United Nations Property Commission. Yes, these are all interrelated. Yes, these communities are involved in Agenda 21. Influencing our children. The goal of the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, for which UNESCO is the lead agency, is to integrate the principles, values, and practices of sustainable development in all aspects of education and learning. Now understand what we said here. Sustainable development, the Agenda 21 version, has made its way into our communities in 2 methods. One is through development and through planning in the local community, and the other is through the education system. If we can change the minds of children and get them to think more placidly, get them to go along with things, it'd be an awful lot easier to implement this stuff which is anti-rights. So, the educational effort will encourage changes in behavior that create a more sustainable future. Now, how many people in this room sent your children to school to have their behavior changed? Any of you? I don't think so. I wanted to learn the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But instead, we're talking about changing people's behavior. That's exactly what these programs do. The UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, which is right here, this is the overview of the program, is nothing but the 40 chapters of Agenda 21 put in a classroom training program and approved by the Department of Education and the National Education Association for use in the United States. Children are being taught that facts are man-made, and I'll show you where they're man-made. They're being taught about eliminating of disagreement, to rely on experts, and it's only okay to question certain ideas. Now, the reason we're in this room tonight is because we're questioning things. You may agree with me, you may not agree with me, that's fine. You get to question me. I get to question the status quo. You get to question the status quo. That's what the part of America is about. But all of a sudden, certain things are not open to question. And this came out of this book, by the way, so you know where I got it. Wealth is socially unjust. So if some guy over here makes $500,000 a year and some guy over here makes $50,000 a year, that's not fair. That's what your children are being taught. Wealth is destroying the environment. Man is causing global warming. That's up in the air right now. The whole thing about global warming is kind of very highly suspect. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's looking iffy. Women and girls are marginalized. Well, there's certainly a time when they were more marginalized than they are today, so again, wouldn't you want to at least be able to question that? I know some very successful women who are doing really, really well for themselves. So I don't know, I want to be able to question these things. Your kids are being taught not to question it, and I'm going to show you how. One way is through a program called Connected Math. This is the Connected Math Guidebook. This book is used throughout the United States of America. It's not in every single classroom. It's for grades 6 through 8 that this teaches mathematics. It uses what they call a standards-based principle, which means we have certain standards, but we don't teach facts. In fact, because this curriculum does not emphasize the arithmetic computation done by hand, some connected math project students may not do well on tests assessing computational skills. In other words, I'm going to go through math and I don't know how to compute? Well, that's what they're being taught, and that comes right out of the teacher's manual. We believe such a trade-off in favor of CMP is very much to the student's advantage in the world of work. But if you think that's troubling, read what's on page 17. Standard 3. I'll take it right out of the book. Page 17. Through discussing problems and their solutions, students learn to reason. They learn that mathematics is man-made, that it is arbitrary, and good solutions are arrived at by consensus among those who are considered expert. So we no longer can just say that, hey, 3 times 3 is, well, we don't know. Because it's a consensus. Your children are being taught consensus. More and more through society, you're going to hear this term consensus pop up. Have you heard about the idea that there's a consensus that there's man-made global warming?
Yes.
There is no such thing in science. As I said, my friend is a scientist. They don't do consensus. They do facts, and you either prove them or you disprove them. And if you prove them, then you go on to become a hypothesis. And if that sticks, then it becomes a theory one day. Did you ever hear of the hypothesis of anthropogenic global warming? There was no such thing. It just became a theory overnight, and suddenly it had the same status as a theory of relativity. How did that happen? It happened through the notion that consensus was okay, and we put it everywhere. And that's what your children are being taught in school. Consensus. Math is arbitrary. Now, there are people fighting back trying to get this out of the school system. In Texas, they got it out of a few of the school districts. But there's a lot of controversy over this. There are reports out that say that this is, quote, an exemplary system. Guess where they come from? The Department of Education. That's who says it's an exemplary system. And the way they get it into the school system is through grants. They give grant money for training, and schools suck up the grant money, and they're stuck with the program. Influencing our children. Now, you might think that all this is just a bad mistake, like new math. And maybe we're just, we tried to teach our kids the right things, so we did a good job, we kind of messed up. Well, I'm going to show you that that's not the case at all. What you're seeing here is intentional. And I got this right out of here, Education for Sustainable Development Toolkit, written by Rosalind McEwen. She's one of those experts. And here's what Rosalind had to say. Generally, more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. You get the connection? You think this is an accident? It's not. Nobody spends, to the best of my knowledge, spends more money on education than we do per child in the United States of America. And yet our grades keep dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. And part of the reason is because of exactly what you see in this booklet. If the kids are highly educated, they consume more, and that's going to be bad for the planet. Therefore, we only want them to know so much, and consensus is easy. If I get a kid that's been drilled consensus in his head, then he becomes very compliant. Working together, we can save our environment and keep our rights and freedoms. That is the real choice. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.